of Africans by police and yoked them to their white employers. In 1960, both the ANC and PAC embarked on a drive to get rid of passes. At a press conference on the 18th of March in 1960, Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe, who was the president of the PAC, spoke of the anti-pass march and was certain that the marchers would observe, and I quote, absolute non-violence. He said that if the apartheid police wanted, they would have the opportunity to demonstrate to the world how brutal they could be. The intention of that march was for Africans to defy carrying a pass and present themselves for mass arrest at police stations. On the 21st of March 1960, 69 mostly unarmed women, children, and elderly men were shot, mainly in the back. 180 injured in Sharpeville, as thousands protested in Soweto, Langa, Ketomana, and other places. The apartheid regime declared a state of emergency on the 30th of March, and on the 8th of April, the ANC and the PAC were banned. Sharpeville brought to an end half a century of non-violent struggle and introduced armed struggle. Today, we are hosting an intergenerational conversation with people who were there and their descendants in order to remember an important part of our history and to be reminded of the sacrifices that people have made in order for us to live in a democratic dispensation. My name is Nzinga Kunda. I'm a business news anchor, and it's my great privilege and pleasure to be your facilitator this afternoon. You may send any comments or questions you have to any of the participants on Facebook, and I'll do my best to pose them to them through the course of this afternoon. I'd like to begin with Dr. Moling Nkosi, who is the Witwatersrand Regional Secretary of the PAC in 1960. He marched with Sobukwe from Mafolo. Dr. Nkosi, a very good afternoon to you, and thank you so much for being with us. If you can take us back to that day and what you remember.
Thanks, Nzinga. One correction, I was the vice president of the PAC in the Witwatersrand region. I will focus on the 21st of March, 1960. That day started very early in the morning at Sobukwe's home in Mufulira. A few of us had gathered there and left his house around 6:30 in the morning and walked through Dube, Pefeni, and Orlando West, where we were joined by other members. We arrived at the Soweto main police station, which was located in Orlando East at around 8:30. Most of the people we met along the way looked surprised at us. At the police station, the facial expressions of the African policemen were that of bewilderment. By the time we stood outside the police station, there were around 200 of us. The officer in charge, I remember his name, Captain J.J. DeWet Steyn, separated us into two groups. Members of the National Executive Committee and other leading political activists were one group, and members of the region were the other group. The first group was driven by the security police to their individual homes, where searches were conducted looking for subversive documents. These searches proved futile because lots of the materials had already been hidden. Once the security police had left with the top leaders, the captain came out of his office and instructed the members of the regional group to form two lines. Naturally, the leaders of this group were up front, and I, as the vice president of the region, was one of the first two. He then called me into his office. On his desk was a pile of freshly printed cyclo-styled forms. He already had one of these forms on his desk. In Afrikaans, he asked for my first name, my surname, my birthday, where was I born, where I worked, and who was my employer, and other questions. Then finally said I should produce a pass. An adversarial exchange ensued when I said I did not have it, and I was no longer willing to carry one. He retorted by saying I had to pay a fine, alternatively be jailed for a week, And if in 2 weeks I did not produce the pass, the fine and the jail time would double. I responded by saying I was not going to pay any fine or carry any pass. At the back of my mind was our slogan: no fine, no defense, no bail. The captain was frustrated and furious. He stood up and abruptly dismissed me, saying that I was looking for serious trouble. The entire discourse from beginning to end was conducted in Afrikaans. I left hurriedly to brief my comrades about how my interrogation went and arranged to return around midday to pick up anyone who had not been arrested. I went to visit Maponya, whose little shop was to act as the distribution center for families whose breadwinners had been arrested. Maponya was also a member of the relief committee that had been set up for that purpose. It was around midday when I returned to the Orlando East Main Police Station. Walking through the tall gum trees towards the police station was eerie. It was absolutely quiet, and there was no one in sight. As I walked hesitantly closer to the police station, someone jumped out from behind a tree. It was Nobuntu Msila, the trusted courier and messenger of the NEC. Nobuntu told me that soon after I had left, the top leadership, which had been driven by the security police to search their homes, had returned and they were arrested. So were the regional members who I had left to be interrogated. She was instructed by Sobukwe to tell me to avoid being arrested. That's how I got away. On the same day, news came in reporting that large crowds of demonstrators were gathering at 3 police stations in Cape Town, as well as Sharpeville and Everton. Then came the shootings in Sharpeville. I think I'd like to stop there because there is a survivor of that incident who was there and has fortunately lived to tell us exactly what happened 61 years ago. She is Mrs. Selina Mnguni. That's all for now, Nzinga.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nkosi. If I can just ask you before we go on to the testimony and words of other people who were there and experienced it, when you look at South Africa now and the way we commemorate 21 March 1960, do you feel as though we are giving adequate weight to the day and what happened?
I honestly don't think we are doing justice to that day. The broader context should really be the starting point on the Human Rights Day, which was declared by the United General Assembly on the 10th of December in 1958. And I think if we look at that and we see what the Bill of Rights says in terms of those rights that have to be respected for every citizen, we will realize that in many instances, those rights are not clear in the minds of our people. And we will also recognize that it is because we haven't adequately communicated the significant importance of those rights. Now, if those rights were very clearly articulated to our population, when you then look at March 21st, you have a context and you begin to realize, that what happened on March 21st was exactly the opposite of the achievement of these human rights. In fact, the more I think about it, I can't believe that in 1958, which is 10 years after the apartheid regime had taken power, the apartheid government decided to go the opposite way the world was moving in terms of human rights. So that story has not been told adequately and clearly enough for people to understand the big tragedy that we experienced in this country during those times. And unfortunately, some of the legacies of that experience are still around, apart from the scars and the deaths that we've experienced.
Thank you, Dr. Mole. We will continue our discussion. And if anybody watching has any comments or questions for any of the people on our panel, please send them through on Facebook. I will raise them a little bit later on. So on the 20th of March, 1960, Stanley Nkosi played Vukani Mawetu repeatedly on SABC's Radio Bantu, which became a clarion call for the next day. He was fired. His son, Skhumbuzo Nkosi, is here to tell us more about his father. Skhumbuzo, it's over to you. Please unmute yourself and then you can speak.
Thank you, Zinga. Leading up to the 21st of March, I was not born at the time. Actually, the story was relayed to me by my dad subsequently. My dad was employed by the SABC, the Radio Fusion Division, which is based in Orlando. It was based in Orlando at the time. And by that time, he had already been an activist for the PAC, as well as an organizer of its events. And it so happened that on the day he was charged with trying to mobilize the community of Soweto towards the launch of the anti-pulse laws. And he and two of his colleagues that were at Radio Fusion devised a really horrible plan in it, I would say. They noted that the security agent who was hosted in the studio was charged with really overseeing the propaganda material which they were charged in announcing and broadcasting. But then the agent would occasionally go and listen to his Saki Sagibur music in his corner office, and really was more interested in monitoring what they said as opposed to what the music they played. They then devised that he would play Vukani Mawetu repeatedly for the whole day as a way of mobilizing and creating awareness of the following day's march, which was going to be in all around the Soweto, Sharpeville, as well as the Western Cape in Ilanga. He continued doing this for pretty much the whole day. And at the end of his shift, he knocked off. The agent was not aware what was going on. And then it so happened that on his way home, I think how word got to whoever was against what he was doing. They managed to really assault him horribly. And he ended up with serious injuries. And notwithstanding that, the following day, with his injuries whilst he was trying to nurse it, he was fired by the SABC and also put on the security agents' watch list. That really, really disturbed our family, especially my mother. My mother's Ruby Amanda Nkosi. And it really brought the traumatic experience to our family and somewhat divided our family to an extent. And it was subsequent to the banning of the ANC and the PAC on the 8th of April that he was arrested in September of the same year, 1960, and he spent 2 years in prison and was subsequently rearrested a few times. And he continued to be a PAC activist. And our family, Shopville Day, will always remain Shopville Day. We understand the context of human rights, but I think the importance of the generations before us or coming behind us are always aware of what it meant, because it meant really the ownership as Africans and being party to this country without having to produce some second or third class document to prove that we are South Africans. So it is a very special day, and we celebrate it in its original context from what we understood our father tried to publicize around the day.
Thank you very much for that insight and sharing that part of history with us. Peter Moghabani, who is a master of photography in South Africa, was there and took some incredibly moving, iconic and disturbing photos on the day. Let's take a look at those very haunting images that have been supplied to this webinar by Bailey's Archive, and then listen to what he had to say about being there. What you're seeing on your screen are some of the visuals that Peter Moghabani took on that day. Peter Moghabani is currently ill, and he does have some words that he has to say around what took place. I'm just going to read them now. His daughter is also with us, and she's going to speak a little bit to us a little bit later on. But this is what Peter Moghabani had to say. I was covering Sobukwe's movements in the morning. When they arrested him, I made my way to Sharpeville. I got to Sharpeville 10 minutes or so after the shooting. I had never in my life seen so many dead bodies. I was totally shocked. Never in my life has I seen such a sight. For a few minutes, I stood still. I could not move. And when I started moving, I took pictures with a wide-angle camera lens from a distance and no close-ups. It was harsh and horrifying, what I saw and witnessed that day. This was an innocent protest. The police opened fire. They killed and injured so many people. It's a very hard day to remember for me, and one of my biggest lessons that I've learned in the art of conflict photography. When I got back to the office, my editor, Tom Hopkinson, gave me one hell of a tongue lashing. Tom said I needed to get closer to the picture. From that day onward, I vowed never to put my feelings before the need to capture the event in my photographs. That's Peter Moghabani's reflection on the pictures that he took, stretching into the distance, the coffins at the Shopville Funeral, as we've just shown you there. The funeral was a few days later after the massacre, and the apartheid government wanted no record of it. I was discreet, hiding my camera, and took pictures. I needed the world to see what was really going on in my country. I was there. I have the pictures of the dead, of the injured, and of those mourning the loss of friends and family. It's hard to remember. I'm not speaking from hearsay. I was there, a witness, and my pictures showed the world what happened on that day. So that was Peter Moghabani's words. And now we're going to listen into Mrs. Selina Mguni. She stays in Sharpeville and was there during the protest. She sat down with Mahauta Molefe to share her recollections of the day.
Selina Mguni, ke moraduwa bona. Ke dula 59 Sharpeville. Rally Street. March 21, Sharpeville. Jabo. Untitled Chapter, police station. Vale, tena tamo mbao no kulitani tena kaki pasipaka. Ilo kono awo. Joan, nafuna isa police station ko. Hausa ibata kan ba ne gidan mi da watan ne biba. Kuna ulu biba ko kashi jaro ba no musantu ga hake ete. Usame ga so. Ne da di piti ta ga da ida ni so ki di pasipaka ga ko ito kulugati. Ko le pasayena. Mela kono hawo. Bere dia kam ko tbesi to mo ko kana. Ako rijare. Kata semi salva ke le bombe ko jare ke pas na uta bantu jare ke pas. Asini la libu ka pa ko lu ba de. Kana ku si sa ko. Ko sa ko kai 1 March 1960. La ba problème ka mangata. Baba Bakiti. If I need it is stated to go to a whole run to come for Bonagati. This is not a pay to work. That's my pay to heal. That was first to get Grandma.
We apologize for that break in transmission, or what seems to be a problem with the sound there. We'll go back to that story a little bit later on. We'll try and include Mamguni's narrative in a different way. Dr. Nkosi, if I can just ask you to comment on what you've heard so far.
There are a number of observations that I would like to make. What Selina was trying to tell us is really very important, because it indicates the extent to which the people in Shopville were mobilized and what they thought they were going to do at the police station. That's the first one, so that it would be useful to get an indication of what else did she have to say. Skumbuzo's story is extremely important in the sense that the SABC was the ultimate vehicle for the Bruder Bond in terms of distributing communications. To have to set up somebody in the rediffusion department to make sure that the news are vetted and they are distributed on the basis of what the head office on Commissioner Street, which is where the SABC was located then, wanted people in African townships to hear. That mechanism was as powerful, in my observation, as the passbook, okay? Let me give you an incident which really illustrates the incredible thing that can happen with you if we don't have a passbook on. It was in the early 50s. I lived in George Koch, and across the street from our home was a chemical factory. This factory somehow got lit. It was on fire. Everybody left the factory, both workers and management. And one African man suddenly realizes he's outside and his passbook is inside. And he decides to dare go into the fire. And he never came back. Okay? Now, you have to ask yourself, what prompted this man to go into the fire in order to save a passbook? Okay? So that is another incident that comes to my mind to illustrate the importance of this day and what we are talking about in terms of human rights and so on. I'd like to give other people an opportunity to say something. I have one or two other things that I could mention in the process. What do you think, Zinga?
Thank you for your insight. We are going to bring more people into the conversation now. Coming up next is Ntate Jodolwe, who was 17 years old at the time. He's a renowned journalist who's received the Order of Ikamanga in silver for his role in ethical journalism in South Africa. He's a founding member of the Pan-Africanist Congress, and in 1960, he was convicted for his role in the 1960 anti-pass campaign that led to the Sharpeville massacre. Can you tell us what happened at the police station that day?
Israel, Africa, as you say, I was 17 years old on this very day, 61 years ago, when I went to jail for the first time. We who went to jail were the lucky ones. On a day when 69 people were shot dead and 180 others, like Moghabani, were wounded. On that day and in that month, hundreds of children lost their parents. Moghabani ke a go tlotla. Ba lapa la kwa Nkosi ke a le tlotla. Ke tlotla malapa a latlhegetsweng ke baratiwa ba bone ka letsatsi leo le malatsi a pele ga leo le morago ga lone. Ke bile ke tlotla lapa la Afrika le le tlhorontshitsweng dingwaga le dingwaga re fetotswe malata mo lefatsheng la bomma rona le borra rona. Ma-Afrika, allow me to start my talk by mentioning that Sobukwe understood the full implications of the anti-pass campaign. At the conference of the PAC at the Orlando Communal Hall on December 19 and 20, 1959, the NEC was given a mandate to devise and plan for the campaign. After that resolution was taken, the women in the hall swaggered up the aisle, taunting us men. If you are scared of the Boers, give us those trousers and we'll show you what should be done. Amongst those women, I remember Mamolapo and Mawalaza swaying their hips in the dance. I looked to the stage and saw Sobukwe wipe tears from his eyes. The first of the 2 times I ever saw Prof weeping. When he stood up, he chopped his hand into his other palm and simply said, "Ndizawunibiza madoda." And then 5 days before the massacre at Sharpeville, that's on March the 16th, 1960, Sobukwe wrote a prophetic letter to the Commissioner of Police, Major General Radameya. I think you referred to that, Nzinga. Quote, "Sir, my organization, the Pan-Africanist Congress, will be starting a sustained, disciplined and non-violent campaign against the pass laws on Monday, the 21st March 1960. I've given strict instructions not only to members of my organization, but also to the African people in general, that they shouldn't allow themselves to be provoked into violent action by anyone. In a press statement I'm releasing soon, I repeat that appeal and make one to the police too. I'm now writing to you to ask you to instruct the police to refrain from actions that may lead to violence. It's unfortunately true that many white policemen brought up in the racist hothouse of South Africa regard themselves as champions of white supremacy and not as law officers. In the African, they see an enemy, a threat, not to law and order, but to their privilege as whites. I therefore appeal to you to instruct your men not to give impossible commands to my people. At 3 a.m. on the morning of March 21, 1960, my comrades and I were in the streets of Orlando East, confronting all men we met. Are you sneaking to work or are you on your way to the police station? No, I'm on my way to the police station. We gathered several groups that morning, but the police in their strange Saracens armored cars. But these Saracens were deployed in the townships for the first time that week. They drive into us and would scatter in all directions. By the time we got to the police station, we were a sizable group that waited for Sobukwe and the people from other townships. The wait gave those who had joined us reluctantly and those who were scared a chance to sneak away. The Sobukwe group, which included Moli Nkosi, arrived and Sobukwe led us into the police station. The police refused to arrest us and we resolved to wait outside the charge office until they arrested us. At about 10 a.m., a convoy of security branch police drove into the police station and some special branch came out with a list of names. Vis Sobukwe, Leballo, Mutuping, the names of the top leadership of the PAC. They were taken away and we learned later to the police headquarters in Van Vella Street in the city. And then suddenly the journalists shot off, telling us people were dying in Sharpeville. By the way, these were the days before cell phones. So the horror of what had happened hit us only the day after in the cells when we saw the front pages of the newspapers. If you watch the pictures at the beginning of this program, you can't remain unmoved. What Sobukwe feared would happen did in fact happen. At the police station, we sat and we sang, we would not leave. Women from the neighborhood brought us sandwiches and tea. It was late afternoon when they started booking us, and so my life as a criminal started. There's so much more to talk about, Madam Nzinga, but I will stop at this point and will contribute as we go along. Thank you so much.
Dr. Lulu, can I just ask you to recount, you spoke in quite graphic details about experiencing jail, what happened, you spoke of bed bugs almost raining from the city. If you give us insight into what that felt like before we move on.
We didn't sleep that night in the cells after we were booked in. We couldn't sleep because suddenly there were bed bugs raining from the ceiling. I think they smelled fresh blood in us. So every time you kill one, then you would find that there are more coming down. They were coming through the cracks in the walls. This was a corrugated iron police cell. We couldn't sleep. We had to walk around to be able to avoid the bed bugs that were biting us. We tried to burn them with newspapers. We burned newspapers and we tried to kill them using this fire. But unfortunately, we failed. And so we had to dance around all night singing and dancing. We sang the songs of Africa. We shall serve, we shall suffer, we shall sacrifice for our freedom. And at the end of a few weeks, 142 of us were sentenced to 300 pounds or 3 years in jail. Half of the sentence was suspended for 3 years. Now, the police did not hit us with the past law offenses as we had anticipated, but they hit us with the law that had ended the Defiance campaign in 1952. That's the Criminal Procedure Act, which provided for a maximum sentence of 10 years imprisonment.
If we can just stay with you for a moment before we continue our discussion, and please remember, if you are watching us on Facebook and you've got any comments or questions, please do send them to us. We will make sure that the participants in this webinar get to read them or answer any questions that you can have. Also, if you're watching us on SABC News, I know we're live on there as well. You can go to the Facebook page and send questions that I'll try and get answered a little bit later on. Before we move on, you've spoken, Tate Xolwe, about the fact that, and I'm going to quote you here, each moment I breathe in and out, I feel, I think, or do something. I'm weaving a stitch in the tapestry that we call history. And you say this art is not reserved for the rich, the politicians, the poor. We are this art, this life. We are history unfolding. How do people watching contribute to what you and Dr. Nkosi have spoken about the recognizing of the significance of this day, how it needs to be commemorated more and remembered more?
When the South African Constitution was adopted, President Mandela did the right thing. He went to Sharpeville to go and promulgate that law. This meant that South Africa, the nation, acknowledged the contribution of the people of Sharpeville to our liberation. Now, the Constitution, the preamble to the Constitution, gives us a compass to live by. We, the people of South Africa, recognize the injustices of our past, honor those who suffered for justice and freedom of our land. So we adopt this constitution in order to heal the divisions of the past, in order to lay the foundations for democratic and open society, in order to, let me repeat this, in order to improve the quality of life of all citizens and free the potential of each person. We haven't even started this. So these are beautiful ways that we could write, but we don't live them. The solemn pledge has lost its meaning as we recite it without understanding its true meaning. we don't feel the meaning. We don't think through the meaning. We don't live its meaning. We don't see the hunger and suffering, the inequality and poverty around us. Of course, the suffering and the poverty are legacies of apartheid, but largely because we've been blinded by the greed around us. A few blacks have ascended to the status of their erstwhile oppressors, while the majority, vast majority, are stuck in the graves that were first dug by the colonizers and the oppressors. Now, if I am conscious every minute of the pledge that we as a nation have made, I will act differently. Whether I'm an ordinary citizen or I'm the president of the country, I will act differently because I am conscious of this solemn pledge we made in 1997. But the most painful part of this whole process is the fact that we took this solemn day, March 21, Shopville Day, and we transferred it into an abstract human rights day. It said we have no feeling for the ugly things that happened to us on March 21. That's probably where we need to start to remind ourselves, to remind our nation of where we come from. That's why I'm always moved every time I see those pictures that we played at the beginning. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The discussant for today's webinar is Professor Tinyiko Maluleke. He's an internationally recognized researcher in his field, specializing in religion and politics. Professor Maluleke is an elected member. Over to you.
Afternoon. I've just been reminded to unmute. Good afternoon, sacred ground with Ntatenkosi and Ntatetolwe. And all the do. Now, included among the poems of Adrian with me ever since I encountered it. And I just want to quote a little bit from it because I have and the poem of Adrian Rech goes like this. I won't read it all, just a few lines. Here, is a map. This is the desert where missiles are planted like corns. This, I'll draw it red, this in deference to the blood split again and again in our beloved. It means the register of massacres, large and small, that's seem to periodically, a massacre was going on. If you look at those names, they begin with Ngudle on 5. September 1963. Now, Perry has put it this way. He says, even if Gray did not initiate the cattle kills we are talking today. An event in which the apartheid police butchered at least 69 lives, including eight women and up. To end his book on Sharpeville, Lodge offers a hanging sentence and a distressing so many of Sharpeville's inhabitants their home place remains a vicinity of restless spirits, tormented ghosts, end of quote. Part of the reason for the persistence of Sharpeville as a vicinity of restless spirits has been our inability, even in post-apartheid South Africa, to level up and come to terms with the massacre. As a country, we have chosen to call this Human Rights Day. I love human rights. I'm sure you do too. But history has taught us that human rights are for humans. Non-humans are excluded. Perhaps we should call the Sharpeville massacre what it was and rename this day accordingly. The only other alternative would be to call it the Robert Sobukwe Day. The same goes for Soweto protests, for the Bisho massacre, for the Boipatong massacre, for Marikana massacre. This is the bloody map of our country and our region. If we do not call these what they are, our country will continue to be a vicinity of restless spirits, dead and alive. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Maruleke. We've got some questions that are coming in from Facebook, and I know we've got 7 minutes to go, and I'd still like to pose questions to everyone. Can I ask if you can answer the questions in the most succinct way possible? The first question says, I'm curious, how did the participants cope with the psychological impact and trauma experienced during that difficult time? I agree that it must have been an extremely thorny path to walk. That the Tolwe or Dr. Nkosi can answer that question for us, please.
If I may go ahead of you, Joe.
Okay.
We carry scars, and these scars will never go away. Fortunately, because March 21st was a turning point in the nature of the struggle in this country, turning point in the sense that non-violent demonstrations came to a halt and stand. Finish. It was over. It became evident that we now have to move into a stage where we take up arms. There was no going back on that. And that happens fortuitously just 2 years or so before the All Africa People's Conference in Ghana took place under the auspices of President Nkrumah, where this noble Pan-Africanist had made his mind up in terms of the support he was prepared to give to the South African liberation movements. I say that deliberately because his position was very clear, and the advice that was given to Nkrumah by George Pedmo and then carried on by Baden, was that, if possible, both the PAC and ANC should work together in order to defeat this monster called apartheid. Now, I mention those things because those of us who were outside continued this struggle in a very different way, motivating international communities to really begin to deal seriously with the problems in South Africa. Some of us were bloody naive. In the United States, we were not aware that there was a fraternity of white supremacists who were willing to work with South Africa and keep us under subjugation. I won't go beyond that because the environment that was created outside allowed us to continue the struggle and not simply sit there and nurse the feelings of being away from home and having seen our people slaughtered the way the professor has just indicated. In a sense, being engaged meant that, you really had to look forward and taking all that you knew with you and see what you can do to contribute to the liberation of this country. And in a nutshell, that's how people like myself survived. And that's how, after 31 years of exile, I came back.
Dr. Tolwe, if you can just answer the question briefly as well before we move on to the last two questions.
I'm not a psychologist, nor am I a psychiatrist, but I think each one of us in South African society is suffering from post-traumatic, whatever they call it,
syndrome.
No normal society would be like we are. We are abnormal. Whether you are black or white, you still carry the scars of apartheid. And we have done very little to try and cleanse ourselves. Now, as I say, I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm not a psychologist, but look at the violence in our society. It comes from the years of violence that Professor Diniko was talking about, the violence that started from 1652. Now, some of us are not just singling out Sharpeville because we think it is worse than everything else. We single it out because for the first time, this violence happened with cameras recording what was happening. And the world became aware of the violence of colonization, the violence of oppression. And that is where the world then turned its spotlight on us. It's a very crucial period in our history. But we haven't healed our wounds. We walk along the streets, we wear beautiful suits, we get into beautiful cars, we stay in beautiful houses, but everywhere we go, we drip blood. South Africa needs to find a way of healing itself. Our constitution provided us with a foundation for that healing. And we haven't done anything about it. It's just words that we recite every so often. But the actual meaning of healing the wounds of the past, we haven't delved into how we do that. That's the tragedy of South Africa today.
Just want to stay on that issue of trauma. Skhumbuzo, you spoke about that a little bit earlier on how an event like Sharpeville impacted the personal and the political. What do younger generations who are dealing with traumas of events like that, such as Sharpeville, do in order to not only preserve memory, as we've spoken about today, but heal and contribute to a country where an event like Sharpeville will never happen again?
I think honest conversations and recognition of the pain and hurt, which especially the younger generation, even the older generations, I sometimes go through the motion of the pain and suffering which my parents went through as a result of that. And whether that slows me down, but it is baggage, like that Kolo has just said. We haven't really dealt with the pain that drips within us, the confusion, the meaning of what human rights is when we have not been consulted about what it meant to us as native South Africans to be subjugated to a pass law or else being shot. We haven't really dealt with that. So how do we begin to have these conversations seriously and honestly and not wish it away by labeling it some opportune and maybe worthwhile day, but we haven't actually done the psychology in how we address the pain and recognize the contribution of those people who stood for a just and fair cause. That needs to be done. And I think the greater portion of the South African population has suffered through that, as Ndadekolo says. And we need to have those conversations ourselves. And they cannot be limited to a few people. we need to have it ourselves. I mean, the Mem Nguni, thanks to Bo Ndato Tlole and the Star Wars from the 70s, how many young people know about Mem Nguni's experiences? And it's somewhere tucked away. And within a generation, it's going to be gone. And we'll be left with a day which does not quite resonate with us today. What is human rights? What does it mean to us Black South Africans? And what does it start? Yes, it's a global recognized day or phenomenal, but what does it mean to us? What was our contribution? And it starts with acknowledging those heroes, those people that were active.
All right, we are actually at the end of our session. I'd just like to acknowledge a question that came in on Facebook and an answer that also came in on that. Dr. Njabe Moghabani, one of the marchers, passed on late this year and was buried early this year. Any recollections about his place and role in this Momentum March at Orlando Police Station? My apologies, the soccer is just getting into my head now. We know the derby's just finished. He served 3 years in jail as the youngest marcher and served another long-term political prison spell on Robben Island. This was almost a decade and a half later after his first prison spell for March 21 protests. Dr. Sats Cooper says, Dr. Aubrey Njobe Moghabani continued his activism, being a founding member of the SA Students Organization and Black People's Convention, and was charged under Terrorism Act, serving 6 years on Robben Island. He was key in organizing the first Sharpeville commemoration as a medical student in Durban 50 years ago. With that, I'm going to have to wrap up our discussion. I'd like to thank everybody that participated in this very important remembrance of what happened on the 21st of March, 1960. Thank you all so much for your contributions. I know I've learned so much and I have so much more respect for the day after hearing everyone's recollections and what took place. Professor Madeleke, thank you so much for your insight as a discussant. We're going to close and try and hear from Mayor Selina Mnguni again. Thank you so much to people who watched on Facebook. Thank you to the SABC for broadcasting this, and it's a good evening.
All right, that is my wonderful colleague Nzinga Nqunta facilitating that discussion by the 70s group around Human Rights Day, and someone putting it very bluntly there, black people facing day-to-day degradation, forced to carry passes, rising up against that lack of freedom, and then 69 people shot to the horror of the world. Just talking about those wounds caused by what happened around this time 61 years ago, saying South Africa has not fully dealt with those. And we'll bring you more discussions around what was Sharpeville Day, now Human Rights Day, looking at where we've come from in South Africa. How far have we really come? And what about those wounds that for many are still raw, sometimes even in post-apartheid South Africa?